The crack of a bullwhip tore through the dawn air as Virginia Saunders clutched her travel-worn carpet bag to her chest, watching in horror as her so-called guardian, Harold Finch, staggered out of the saloon with a bottle of whiskey clutched in his bony fingers. Fort Collins, Colorado had been her last hope, a teaching position secured through months of correspondence that had promised her independence from the man who had controlled her life since her parents' deaths 5 years ago. "Harold, you didn't." Virginia called out, her honey-brown hair escaping its pins as she rushed forward, her sensible boots kicking up dust in the early morning light. "Please tell me you didn't sell my teaching position." Harold's bloodshot eyes narrowed as he took a swig from the bottle. "Course I did, girl. What need have you for teaching when I'm the one what looks after you? Got 4 bottles of Malone's finest for it too. That school board man was mighty understanding when I explained you wouldn't be able to fulfill your obligations." Virginia felt her future crumbling around her. At 22 years old, she had endured Harold's guardianship only by clinging to the promise of this teaching post, a position she had secured through her own merits and correspondence. Harold had merely accompanied her on the journey west because propriety demanded it, or so she had believed. "You had no right," she whispered, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "I am of legal age, Harold. That position was mine. Legal age or not, you're still under my care until you're properly married off," Harold sneered, swaying slightly. "Besides, I did you a favor. This town ain't fit for a lady of your delicate sensibilities." Virginia glanced around at Fort Collins. The town was small but respectable, with a main street lined with establishments ranging from the general store to the offending saloon from which Harold had just emerged. In the distance, she could see rolling plains giving way to the majestic Rocky Mountains. This was to have been her home, her chance for independence. "I refuse to return east with you," Virginia declared, standing tall despite her modest height. "You've stolen my position, but you will not steal my future." Harold laughed, a harsh sound that matched the cruelty in his eyes. "And just how do you plan to survive, Miss Virginia? You ain't got 2 cents to rub together." "I will find a way," she replied, turning on her heel. Her heart was pounding, but her resolve was firm. She could not return to Philadelphia under Harold's thumb. As Virginia marched away, the sound of hoofbeats approached from the opposite direction. A tall man atop a magnificent chestnut stallion rode into town, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the rising sun. He wore no badge, but there was an undeniable air of authority about him as he dismounted in one fluid motion. "Morning, Mr. Mitchell," called the shopkeeper who was sweeping the boardwalk in front of his store. "Morning, Thomas," the newcomer replied, his voice deep and steady. "Looks like we've got some new arrivals." Virginia was too distraught to pay much attention to the exchange as she headed toward the only place she could think to go, the schoolhouse that was to have been her domain. Perhaps the school board could be reasoned with once they understood the situation. Mason Mitchell tied his horse to the hitching post and observed the scene with interest. He'd noticed the young woman's distress and the older man's obvious inebriation. Something about the set of her shoulders proud, despite what appeared to be unfortunate circumstances, caught his attention. "That's Harold Finch," the shopkeeper informed him quietly. "Arrived on yesterday's stage with Miss Saunders. She was meant to be our new schoolteacher. Word is he just sold her position to Malone for whiskey." Mason's brow furrowed beneath the brim of his hat. "He can't sell a teaching position that isn't his to sell." Well, he convinced the school board chairman that she was unsuitable. Chairman Willis was already nervous about hiring an unmarried woman sight unseen. Didn't take much persuading, especially with Malone offering his niece as a replacement. Mason watched as Virginia disappeared around the corner. "The school board meeting still set for noon." "Yes, sir. You planning on attending?" Mason nodded, his jaw set in determination. "I believe I am." Virginia stood before the small, whitewashed schoolhouse with its single room and bell tower. The building was modest, but well-maintained, with a small porch and large windows to let in the light. It represented everything she had worked toward a chance to build a life of her own making. She climbed the steps and tried the door, finding it unlocked. Inside, rows of simple desks faced a larger teacher's desk at the front. A blackboard hung on the wall, and bookshelves, though sparsely filled, stood ready for more volumes. It was perfect, and it had been hers for less than a day. Virginia sank into the teacher's chair, finally allowing her tears to fall. What was she to do now? Her funds were nearly depleted after the journey west. Harold controlled what little inheritance her parents had left her. She had no family to turn to, no friends in this strange town. The creak of the schoolhouse door startled her from her thoughts. Virginia hastily wiped her eyes, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable state. "Pardon the intrusion, madam," came a deep voice. Virginia looked up to see a tall man removing his hat as he stepped inside. His dark hair was slightly too long, and his face was tanned from the sun. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the frontier, yet there was a gentleness in his blue eyes that surprised her. "The schoolhouse is not currently in use," Virginia said, attempting to regain her composure. "I believe you've made a mistake." "No mistake, Miss Saunders," he replied. "I'm Mason Mitchell. I own the largest cattle ranch outside of town and serve on the town council. I overheard what happened with your guardian." Virginia's cheeks flushed with humiliation. "News travels quickly in Fort Collins, it seems." "It's a small town," Mason acknowledged, stepping further into the schoolroom, "but a good one. We've been waiting for a proper teacher for nearly a year now. The children deserve better than the rotating schedule of parents who have been filling in." "I was prepared to give them my best," Virginia said softly. "I've taught for 3 years in Philadelphia. I have references, curriculum plans." Mason nodded, studying her with an intensity that made Virginia straighten her posture instinctively. "I believe you," he said simply. "And I don't think your guardian had any right to make decisions on your behalf, especially if you're of age as you claim to him." Hope flickered within Virginia. "You heard that exchange? Enough of it," Mason confirmed. "Miss Saunders, I'd like to propose a solution. The school board is meeting at noon today. I'd like you to join me and present your credentials directly to them." Virginia hesitated, glancing down at her travel-stained dress. "I'm hardly presentable for such a meeting." Mason's smile was warm and reassuring. "You'll find Fort Collins less concerned with appearances than substance, Miss Saunders. But if it makes you more comfortable, there's time to refresh yourself. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house would be happy to offer you a room to rest and change." "I don't have the means to consider it an advance on your teaching salary," Mason interrupted smoothly. "Once the board reinstates your position, you can repay it if it eases your mind." Virginia studied the man before her, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. She found none in his forthright gaze. "Why would you help me, Mr. Mitchell? You don't know me." "I know we need a qualified teacher," he replied. "And I know that what your guardian did wasn't right. In the West, we value fairness and a person's word. The school board gave you their word when they hired you, and I aim to see they honor it." For the first time since arriving in Fort Collins, Virginia felt a glimmer of genuine hope. "Then I accept your assistance, Mr. Mitchell, and I thank you for it." Mason nodded, replacing his hat. "I'll escort you to the boarding house and return for you at 11:30. The school board won't know what hit them." As they stepped out of the schoolhouse, Virginia caught sight of Harold stumbling from the saloon across the street. His eyes narrowed when he spotted her with Mason. "That's my ward you're consorting with, mister," Harold called out, his words slurring slightly. "She's returning east with me tomorrow." Mason stepped slightly in front of Virginia in a protective gesture that she found both comforting and somewhat presumptuous. "The lady has business with the school board, Mr. Finch," Mason replied evenly. "As for her travel plans, I believe Miss Saunders is capable of determining those for herself." Harold's face darkened with anger, but something in Mason's steady gaze must have given him pause. He spat into the dirt and turned back toward the saloon. "We'll see about that," he muttered. "Is he always so charming?" Mason asked quietly as they continued toward the boarding house. Despite everything, Virginia found herself smiling. "Harold has been my guardian since I was 17. My parents died within months of each other, my father from heart failure and my mother from pneumonia soon after. Harold was my father's business associate and offered to serve as my guardian until I was of age or married. And now, I turned 22 in April. I completed my teacher's education last year and have been corresponding with school boards throughout the West. Fort Collins was the first to offer me a position." "Without your guardian's knowledge?" Mason asked. Virginia hesitated, then nodded. "Harold made it clear he expected me to marry his nephew. a man I cannot abide. When the offer from Fort Collins came, I persuaded Harold that accompanying me west would provide him business opportunities. I had hoped that once here, with a position secured, I could establish my independence. They reached the boarding house, a neat two-story structure with a wide porch and window boxes filled with hardy flowers. I underestimated his determination to maintain control, Virginia admitted, and his fondness for whiskey. Mason's expression was thoughtful. You've shown considerable courage in coming this far, Miss Saunders. A few more hours of bravery may be all you need. After introducing Virginia to Mrs. Henderson, a kindly widow who immediately took her under her wing, Mason departed with a promise to return before the board meeting. That Mason Mitchell is a good man, Mrs. Henderson remarked as she showed Virginia to a small but clean room. Came here 5 years ago with nothing but determination and built the most prosperous ranch in the territory. He's done much for this town. He seems very capable, Virginia replied cautiously. Mrs. Henderson chuckled. Capable, yes, and unmarried, which has every mother and widow in town trying to catch his eye, not that he notices. Too busy with that ranch of his and serving on every committee in Fort Collins. Virginia accepted the basin of warm water and soap that Mrs. Henderson provided, grateful for the chance to wash away the dust of travel. He mentioned he's on the town school board. He even helped organize the Harvest Festival last fall. If something needs doing in Fort Collins, Mason Mitchell usually has a hand in it. After Mrs. Henderson left, Virginia changed into her one good dress, a deep blue cotton with a modest lace collar. She rebraided her hair and pinned it neatly at the nape of her neck. From her carpet bag, she extracted her teaching credentials and letters of recommendation, smoothing the creases carefully. As promised, Mason returned promptly, his eyes widening slightly at Virginia's transformed appearance. You clean up well, Miss Saunders, he said, offering his arm. As do you, Mr. Mitchell, she replied, noting he had exchanged his work clothes for a clean shirt and vest. His hair was still damp from what must have been a hasty wash. They walked to the town hall, a modest building that served multiple functions for the growing community. Inside, several men were already seated around a large table. Gentlemen, Mason announced as they entered, may I present Miss Virginia Saunders, the teacher you hired for our school? The men looked up with varying expressions of surprise and discomfort. A portly man Virginia recognized as Chairman Willis from their correspondence rose to his feet. Miss Saunders, this is unexpected. Your guardian informed us this morning that you would not be taking the position. My guardian spoke without my knowledge or consent, Mr. Willis, Virginia replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I am 22 years old and fully qualified to teach, as my credentials will confirm. She placed her documents on the table. I have traveled over 1,000 miles to fulfill the commitment I made to this town. I intend to honor that commitment. Another board member, a thin man with spectacles, cleared his throat. But we've already promised the position to Miss Malone. Her uncle sold you a position that wasn't his to sell, Mason interrupted. Gentlemen, we all know Malone's niece has no teaching experience. She's barely 18 herself. She's a respectable young lady from a local family, Willis argued. And Miss Saunders is a qualified educator who received your written offer and accepted in good faith, Mason countered. Are we the kind of town that breaks its word? The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Virginia presented her case eloquently, outlining her teaching philosophy and experience. Mason supported her with strategic comments about the town's need for quality education if they hoped to attract more settlers with families. Finally, Chairman Willis sighed in resignation. It seems we have made a grave error in listening to Mr. Finch. Miss Saunders, if you are still willing to accept the position, it is yours. Relief flooded through Virginia. Thank you, Mr. Willis. I promise you won't regret your decision. As they left the town hall, Virginia turned to Mason with a brilliant smile. I cannot thank you enough, Mr. Mitchell. You've saved my future. Mason's expression sobered slightly. Your future isn't entirely secure yet, Miss Saunders. Your guardian won't take this decision lightly. As if summoned by his words, Harold appeared across the street, his face contorted with rage when he saw Virginia's triumphant expression. You ungrateful girl, he shouted, striding toward them. After all I've done for you, Mason stepped forward. Mr. Finch, the school board has reinstated Miss Saunders' position. I suggest you accept their decision gracefully, Harold sneered. She remains under my guardianship until properly married. I forbid her from taking this position. We return east tomorrow. Virginia's heart sank. Though she was legally an adult, the social expectations of the time meant that Harold's claim carried weight. Without family or connections in Fort Collins, she was vulnerable. Mason's voice cut through her rising panic. Miss Saunders is of age. She has accepted a position of employment. Should you attempt to force her return, I believe Sheriff Turner would consider it kidnapping. You have no authority, Harold began. I have the authority of this town behind me, Mason replied calmly. Fort Collins has hired Miss Saunders as its teacher. We intend to honor that contract. The stage leaves at noon tomorrow. You're welcome to be on it, Mr. Finch, but Miss Saunders stays. Harold's face flushed with fury, but he seemed to recognize the determination in Mason's stance. This isn't over, he spat before stalking away toward the saloon. Virginia released a shaky breath. He won't give up so easily. No, Mason agreed, but neither will we. I'll speak with Sheriff Turner and make him aware of the situation. In the meantime, you should remain at the boarding house where Mrs. Henderson can keep an eye on you. I don't wish to be a burden. You're not a burden, Miss Saunders. You're our teacher. Mason smiled, and Virginia felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. Now let's get you properly settled. School starts in a week and there's much to prepare. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Virginia threw herself into preparing the schoolhouse, organizing books, creating lesson plans, and meeting the families of her future pupils. Mason proved invaluable, introducing her to key members of the community and helping secure additional supplies for the school. To Virginia's relief, Harold remained largely absent, spending most of his time at the saloon. When they did cross paths, he would mutter threats under his breath, but he made no direct attempts to interfere with her preparations. He's waiting for the right moment, Virginia confided to Mason as they sorted through a donation of books for the school library. Harold is nothing if not patient when it serves his purpose. Mason handed her a well-worn copy of Robinson Crusoe. What purpose does controlling your life serve? Forgive my directness, but there must be some motivation beyond simple guardianship. Virginia hesitated before answering. My parents left a modest inheritance. Harold has managed it as my guardian, but once I'm fully independent, I can claim it. I suspect very little remains after 5 years of his management. That explains his persistence, Mason remarked. Money is a powerful motivator. It's more than that, Virginia admitted. Harold's business was failing even before my parents died. His nephew Thomas was to marry me and secure both my inheritance and my father's business connections. It was all arranged without my knowledge or consent. Mason's expression darkened. That's not a marriage, that's a business transaction. Precisely why I sought a teaching position as far west as possible, Virginia replied with a small smile. I had hoped distance would solve my problem. It might yet, Mason said thoughtfully. Harold can't stay in Fort Collins forever. Sooner or later, he'll have to return east. That evening, Virginia was arranging her few belongings in her room at the boarding house when Mrs. Henderson knocked on her door. You have a visitor, dear. Mr. Finch is asking to speak with you. Virginia's stomach clenched with apprehension, but she nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I'll come down. Harold waited in the small parlor, looking unexpectedly sober and properly attired. His manner was subdued as Virginia entered. Virginia, my dear, I've come to apologize, he said, his voice solicitous. I've behaved abominably. Virginia remained standing, keeping her distance. What do you want, Harold, to make amends? He replied smoothly. I've realized I cannot stand in the way of your independence any longer. You're a grown woman with admirable ambitions. I was wrong to interfere. Virginia studied him skeptically. This sudden change of heart is surprising. Harold smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I've had time to reflect. I leave on tomorrow's stage, but before I go, I wish to properly transfer your inheritance to you. I've prepared the paperwork. We need only visit the bank in the morning to make it official. Virginia's suspicion deepened. The bank in Fort Collins wouldn't handle such a transfer. My inheritance is held in Philadelphia. There are ways to arrange such matters through correspondence, Harold insisted. I've discussed it with the bank manager. If you'll just accompany me tomorrow morning, we can resolve everything amicably. I have school preparations in the morning, Virginia replied. Perhaps the afternoon would be better. Harold's pleasant expression faltered momentarily. The stage leaves at noon. It must be in the morning. Then I'm afraid it will have to wait until your next visit, Virginia said firmly. Or we can handle it through correspondence as you suggested. Harold's mask of contrition slipped further. You obstinate girl, do you think I don't know what you're doing? Your precious cowboy can't protect you forever. Mr. Mitchell has been kind enough to help me establish myself professionally in Fort Collins, Virginia replied evenly. His assistance has been entirely proper, Harold sneered. Nothing is proper about your situation, Virginia. An unmarried woman living alone, associating freely with an unmarried man. What would your parents say? My parents valued education and independence, Virginia countered. They would be proud of me for pursuing both. Your parents arranged your engagement to Thomas before they died, Harold shot back. You dishonor their memory by refusing to fulfill their wishes. Virginia's composure finally cracked. My parents would never have forced me into a loveless marriage for financial gain. They wanted my happiness above all. Their wishes are clear in their will, Harold insisted. You are to marry Thomas and unite our family's interests. Show me where in the will it states that, Virginia demanded. You've never allowed me to read it in its entirety. Harold's expression grew calculating. Come with me to the bank tomorrow and I'll show you the will along with your inheritance papers. Virginia shook her head. No, Harold, I won't be manipulated anymore. If you truly wish to resolve matters, leave a copy of the will with Mr. Willis before you depart. I'll review it and correspond with you through proper channels. Harold's facade of reasonableness vanished completely. You'll regret this defiance, Virginia. One way or another, you'll return east and fulfill your obligations. With that threat hanging in the air, he stormed out, nearly colliding with Mason, who was just arriving at the boarding house. Evening, Mr. Finch, Mason said coolly. Leaving so soon. Harold brushed past him without a word, disappearing into the growing darkness. Mason entered the parlor to find Virginia visibly shaken. Are you all right? I saw Finch leaving in quite a state. Virginia sank onto the sofa. He tried to convince me to go to the bank with him tomorrow morning. Something about transferring my inheritance. It was clearly a ruse to get me alone. Mason's expression hardened. I suspected he might try something like this before leaving. The stage doesn't actually depart until the day after tomorrow. He lied about that. He mentioned a will that supposedly stipulates I must marry his nephew, Virginia continued. I've never been allowed to read it in full, but I cannot believe my parents would have included such a provision. Did your parents leave their affairs with a reputable lawyer? Mason asked, sitting beside her. Mr. Harrington in Philadelphia. He handled all our family's legal matters for decades. Then tomorrow we'll send a telegram to Mr. Harrington requesting a copy of the will, Mason suggested. Harold won't expect you to verify his claims so quickly. Virginia nodded gratefully. That's an excellent idea. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. I don't know how I would manage this situation without your assistance. Mason smiled, his blue eyes warm in the lamplight. You'd manage just fine, Miss Saunders. You're remarkably resourceful. But I'm happy to help all the same. The next morning, Virginia rose early, eager to send the telegram before beginning her school preparations. She was surprised to find Mason already waiting for her at the boarding house, his expression grim. What's happened? She asked immediately. Harold broke into the schoolhouse last night, Mason replied. He's destroyed many of your preparations and supplies. Virginia gasped in dismay. But why? What purpose does such destruction serve? To delay the school opening, Mason explained as they hurried toward the schoolhouse. If you can't begin teaching as scheduled, the school board might reconsider their decision. When they reached the schoolhouse, Virginia's heart sank at the sight that greeted them. Books lay torn and scattered across the floor, desks were overturned, the blackboard had been smashed. Worst of all, Virginia's carefully prepared lesson plans and teaching materials were shredded beyond repair. This will take weeks to restore, Virginia whispered, fighting back tears of frustration. The children were counting on school beginning next Monday. Mason surveyed the damage, his jaw tight with anger. This is criminal destruction. Sheriff Turner is already looking for Finch, but he seems to have disappeared from his room at the hotel. Virginia knelt to gather the remains of a primer she had annotated for her younger students. Even if he's caught, the damage is done. The school board will have no choice but to delay the term. Mason was silent for a long moment, studying the devastation. Then he turned to Virginia with determination in his eyes. Not if we rebuild it in time. That's impossible, Virginia protested. We'd need new books, supplies, furniture. We have a community that values education, Mason interrupted. Let me speak with the town council. I believe Fort Collins will rise to this challenge. True to his word, Mason called an emergency meeting of the town council that afternoon. Virginia presented the extent of the damage, and the council unanimously voted to allocate emergency funds for replacement supplies. More importantly, Mason rallied the townspeople to help with the repairs. The following day, Virginia arrived at the schoolhouse to find a dozen men already at work replacing the broken windows and repairing the damaged furniture. Women from town brought food for the workers and organized a book drive to replace the destroyed volumes. Children eagerly helped clean up debris and decorate the walls with new maps and charts donated by the general store. I've never seen anything like this, Virginia marveled as she worked alongside Mason to reassemble the teacher's desk. That's the spirit of the West, Mason replied, skillfully driving a nail to secure a loose board. We look after our own. Virginia paused in her work. Am I one of your own now? I've only been here a week. Mason met her gaze steadily. You became one of us the moment you decided to stay and fight for your place here. Something in his expression made Virginia's heart beat faster. She looked away, suddenly flustered. Well, I'm grateful for everyone's help. I never expected such kindness from strangers. They're not strangers anymore, Mason pointed out gently. They're your neighbors now, your community. By sunset, the transformation was remarkable. While not everything could be replaced immediately, the schoolhouse was functional once more. The school board chairman, Mr. Willis, inspected the repairs and declared that classes could begin as scheduled on Monday. As the volunteers departed, Mason lingered behind with Virginia. There's something else we need to address, he said seriously. Harold is still in town, despite his claim about leaving on today's stage. Virginia's brief feeling of triumph faded. You think he'll try again to sabotage the school, or worse? Mason replied grimly. Sheriff Turner found evidence that Harold purchased tickets for 2 on tomorrow's stage. He clearly intends to force you to accompany him. Fear flashed through Virginia. He can't possibly believe I would go willingly after what he's done. I don't think he plans to give you a choice, Mason said, which is why you shouldn't stay at the boarding house tonight. It's too predictable. Virginia frowned. Where would I go? My ranch is outside town. Harold wouldn't think to look for you there, and I have several ranch hands who can keep watch. Virginia hesitated, aware of the impropriety of staying at a single man's home even under these circumstances. People would talk. Mrs. Henderson will accompany you as a chaperone, Mason assured her. She's already agreed. Your reputation will remain intact, and more importantly, you'll be safe. Despite her reservations, Virginia recognized the wisdom of the plan. Very well, thank you for thinking of my safety. That evening, Virginia and Mrs. Henderson rode out to the Mitchell Ranch in Mason's wagon. As they crested a hill, Virginia caught her first glimpse of the property, a sprawling ranch house surrounded by outbuildings, corrals, and pastures that stretched toward the mountains. It's beautiful, Virginia murmured. Mason built most of it himself when he first claimed the land, Mrs. Henderson told her. Started with just a one-room cabin and expanded as his herd grew. Now it's the finest ranch in the territory. Mason welcomed them warmly, showing Virginia to a comfortable guest room while Mrs. Henderson was settled in the adjacent chamber. The house was surprisingly well appointed for a bachelor's residence, with solid furniture and even a few touches like curtains and braided rugs that suggested a desire for hominess beyond mere function. My sister visited last summer, Mason explained when Virginia commented on the feminine touches. She insisted I needed civilizing influences in my home. After a hearty dinner prepared by the ranch cook, they sat on the wide porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and purple. Mrs. Henderson, exhausted by the day's events, had already retired to her room. I sent one of my men to keep watch near the boarding house, Mason informed Virginia. If Harold makes any move there looking for you, we'll know about it. Virginia nodded gratefully. This will be over tomorrow when the stage leaves. Even Harold must realize he can't stay in Fort Collins indefinitely. Unless he's truly desperate, Mason cautioned. Men like that can be unpredictable when their plans are thwarted. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the chirping of crickets. Virginia found herself studying Mason's profile in the fading light, noting the strong line of his jaw and the thoughtful set of his mouth. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have simply allowed events to unfold without involving yourself." Mason turned to face her. "I told you we needed a qualified teacher." "Is that all?" Virginia pressed. Sensing there was more to his motivation, Mason hesitated, then spoke with careful honesty. "When I first came west, I had nothing but determination and a dream. No one knew me here, no one had any reason to trust me or help me establish myself. But people did help strangers who became neighbors, neighbors who became friends. I promised myself I would do the same for others when the opportunity arose." Virginia smiled softly. "That's a noble philosophy." "It's a practical one," Mason countered. "Communities only thrive when people support each other. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I admired your courage from the moment I saw you standing up to Harold in the street. You didn't need rescuing, you just needed someone to stand beside you while you rescued yourself." The simple truth of his words touched Virginia deeply. Throughout her ordeal with Harold, she had feared being seen as a helpless female in need of protection. Mason was the first person to recognize and respect her independence while still offering genuine assistance. "Thank you for seeing me clearly," she said softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Virginia felt a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Then Mason cleared his throat and stood. "It's getting late, you should rest. Tomorrow will bring resolution one way or another." Virginia nodded and rose as well. "Good night, Mr. Mitchell." "And thank you for your hospitality." "Mason," he corrected gently. "I think we've moved beyond formalities, don't you?" Virginia smiled. "Good night, Mason, I'm Virginia." "Good night, Virginia, sleep well." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Virginia woke feeling refreshed despite the uncertainty hanging over her. She dressed carefully in her blue dress, determined to face whatever the day might bring with dignity and courage. When she entered the kitchen, she found Mason already there, drinking coffee and studying a telegram. "News from Philadelphia," he announced, handing her the paper. "Your Mr. Harrington was prompt in his reply." Virginia read the telegram eagerly. "It's as I suspected. There is no provision in my parents' will requiring me to marry anyone. Harold fabricated that claim entirely." And she gasped softly. "My inheritance is considerably larger than Harold led me to believe. Mr. Harrington expresses concern that Harold has been mismanaging the funds." "This confirms what we suspected," Mason said. "Harold's desperation stems from financial misdeeds he's trying to conceal. Once you're fully independent, his access to your funds ends and his crimes might be exposed." Mrs. Henderson joined them, and after breakfast, they prepared to return to town. The stage was scheduled to depart at noon, and Virginia was determined to see Harold on it. As Mason drove them back to Fort Collins, Virginia noticed a plume of smoke rising from the direction of town. "Something's burning," she said, alarm rising in her voice. Mason urged the horses to a faster pace. As they drew closer to town, the smoke grew thicker and Virginia's dread increased. "It's coming from the school direction," Mason said grimly. They arrived in town to find chaos. People were rushing toward the schoolhouse, where flames were already consuming the roof. A bucket brigade had formed, but it was clear their efforts were too late to save the structure. Virginia leapt from the wagon before it had fully stopped, racing toward the burning building. Mason caught up with her quickly, holding her back from approaching too close to the dangerous flames. "The schoolhouse," she whispered in anguish. "After all our work yesterday." Sheriff Turner approached them, his face grim beneath his hat. "Miss Saunders, I'm afraid this was deliberate. Several townspeople saw Harold Finch running from the building just as the flames appeared." "Where is he now?" Mason demanded, trying to leave town. "I've got men watching the stage depot and the livery. He won't get far." But Virginia barely heard them, her eyes fixed on the burning schoolhouse. All her hopes, her dreams of independence, her carefully cultivated plans for teaching the children of Fort Collins, all of it seemed to be turning to ash before her eyes. "I'll never be free of him," she murmured. "He'll destroy everything I try to build." Mason turned her gently to face him. "Virginia, look around you." She tore her gaze from the flames to see the townspeople working desperately to save the schoolhouse, men passing buckets, women comforting crying children, everyone united in their effort. "This is your community," Mason said firmly. "They won't let Harold win." "Neither will I." As the last of the flames were extinguished, the extent of the damage became clear. The schoolhouse was beyond repair, a charred skeleton of its former self. The school board gathered near the ruins, their expressions somber. "This is a terrible setback," Chairman Willis acknowledged as Virginia and Mason joined them. "I'm afraid we'll have to suspend classes indefinitely until we can rebuild." Virginia's heart sank, but before she could speak, Mason stepped forward. "Gentlemen, I have a proposal. My ranch has a bunkhouse that's currently unused since most of my hands have built their own cabins. It's sturdy, clean, and could be converted into a temporary schoolroom within days." The board members exchanged glances. "That's very generous, Mitchell," Willis said cautiously, "but your ranch is 3 miles outside town. How would the children get there?" "I'll organize transportation," Mason replied without hesitation. "We can use my wagons to collect the children in the morning and return them in the afternoon." "And what about permanent plans?" another board member asked. "We can't use your bunkhouse forever." Mason's expression grew determined. "I'll build a new schoolhouse right here on this site better than before. I have the resources and the men to do it quickly." Virginia stared at him in astonishment. "Mason, that's too much to ask. The cost alone is an investment in the future of Fort Collins," Mason finished for her. "Besides, I won't be doing it alone. Every able-bodied person in this town will help, isn't that right, gentlemen?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd that had gathered to listen. "Then it's settled," Mason declared. "School will begin as scheduled on Monday at my ranch, and construction on the new schoolhouse will start immediately thereafter." As the crowd dispersed to salvage what they could from the ruins, Sheriff Turner approached with news. "We've apprehended Harold Finch. He was trying to steal a horse from the livery." "Thank goodness," Virginia sighed with relief. "What happens now?" "He'll face charges of arson and attempted theft," the sheriff replied. "Those are serious crimes, Miss Saunders. He'll be in custody for quite some time." The weight that had been pressing on Virginia's chest since Harold's first interference began to lift. She turned to Mason, overwhelmed by his generosity. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done," she said softly. "Most men would have walked away from such complications long ago." Mason smiled, reaching out to gently brush a smudge of ash from her cheek. "Most men haven't met a woman like you, Virginia Saunders." The following days passed in a flurry of activity. The bunkhouse was transformed into a serviceable classroom with desks constructed by the ranch hands, books donated by townspeople, and a new blackboard provided by the general store. Virginia worked alongside Mason and his men, her determination to create a proper learning environment never faltering. On Monday morning, Mason's wagons rumbled into town, collecting excited children for their first day of school. Parents waved from porches, visibly relieved that their children's education would continue despite the setback. The makeshift classroom buzzed with energy as Virginia welcomed 26 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. Despite the unusual setting, she quickly established routines and expectations, drawing on her experience and natural authority. From his position by the corral, Mason watched through the bunkhouse window as Virginia moved among the children, her face animated as she engaged them in learning. Something warm and unfamiliar stirred in his chest, a feeling of rightness, of pieces falling into place that he hadn't known were missing. That evening, after the children had been returned to town and Virginia had finished preparing for the next day, they sat together on the porch of the main house. "You were magnificent today," Mason told her. "Those children are lucky to have you as their teacher." Virginia smiled, pleased by his praise. "They're bright and eager to learn. Even in difficult circumstances, their enthusiasm is inspiring." "Speaking of circumstances," Mason said, "construction on the new schoolhouse begins tomorrow." I've hired the best builders in the county, and supplies are already being delivered to the site. Virginia turned to him in surprise. So quickly, I assumed it would take weeks just to organize the project. I don't believe in wasting time when something important needs doing, Mason replied simply. The children deserve a proper school and you deserve a proper classroom. The cost must be considerable, Virginia ventured carefully. Mason shrugged. My ranch has prospered. I can think of no better use for those profits than investing in the community's future. Virginia studied him in the fading light. You're an unusual man, Mason Mitchell. Most successful ranchers I've heard of are interested primarily in expanding their holdings and increasing their herds. I have enough land and cattle, Mason said thoughtfully. What good is success if it doesn't improve life for those around you? Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Each morning, Virginia would teach in the converted bunkhouse. In the afternoons after the children had been returned to town, she would often ride with Mason to check on the progress of the new schoolhouse. The structure was rising impressively from the ashes of the old building. Mason had designed it to be larger and more functional, with separate cloakrooms for boys and girls, a proper library alcove, and even living quarters for the teacher attached to the rear of the building. Teacher accommodations, Virginia questioned when Mason showed her the plans. That's an unexpected addition. Fort Collins is growing, Mason explained. We should plan for the future when we might have multiple teachers who need housing. Besides, it ensures that whatever happens, our teacher will always have a secure place to live. Virginia touched the plans with thoughtful fingers. It's very forward-thinking. Thank you for considering such details. As they worked together on school matters, Virginia found herself increasingly drawn to Mason. His integrity, intelligence, and genuine concern for others were qualities she had rarely encountered in men of her acquaintance in Philadelphia. His occasional touches a hand steadying her as she climbed down from a wagon, fingers brushing as they exchanged books or papers, sent unexpected thrills through her that both confused and exhilarated her. For his part, Mason found himself inventing reasons to be near Virginia. He adjusted his ranch schedule to accommodate the school transportation, delegated tasks he would normally handle personally, and spent more time in town than he had in years. His ranch hands exchanged knowing glances but said nothing, recognizing the changes in their normally focused employer. News came from Philadelphia that further solidified Virginia's position. Mr. Harrington had launched a formal investigation into Harold's management of her inheritance and found significant evidence of embezzlement. Harold would face additional charges upon his eventual return east. More importantly, Virginia's financial independence was now assured, with her inheritance to be transferred to a bank of her choosing. You're a wealthy woman, it seems, Mason remarked when Virginia shared the news. Comfortable, at least, Virginia acknowledged. Though money has never been my primary concern, independence and meaningful work have always mattered more to me. Mason nodded in understanding. Those are values I share, though I admit prosperity makes it easier to maintain independence. One evening in late October, nearly 2 months after Virginia's arrival in Fort Collins, Mason invited her to dinner at his house. The school year was well established, with the children thriving under Virginia's instruction. The new schoolhouse was nearing completion, ahead of schedule due to Mason's efficient management of the project. Virginia arrived to find the ranch house transformed. Lanterns illuminated the porch, and inside, the dining table was set with fine china and crystal that she hadn't seen during her previous stay. This is quite an occasion, she commented as Mason took her wrap. I thought we should celebrate, he replied, looking unusually nervous. The schoolhouse will be ready next week, and your first term has been remarkably successful despite the challenges. They dined on a meal prepared by Mason himself, a fact that both surprised and touched Virginia. The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on the children's progress, books they both enjoyed, and plans for the school's future. As they finished their coffee, Mason grew quiet, his expression thoughtful. Virginia, he finally said, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you. Virginia set down her cup, suddenly aware of the intensity in his blue eyes. Yes, these past 2 months have been transformative for me, Mason began carefully. Before you arrived, my life was focused entirely on my ranch and my responsibilities to the town. I was content, but I realize now that something was missing. Virginia's heart began to race. And what was that, partnership? Mason replied simply. The kind of connection that makes both people stronger, better versions of themselves. He reached across the table to take her hand. I've come to care for you deeply, Virginia. Your courage, your intelligence, your determination, everything about you has captured my heart in ways I never expected. Virginia felt a flush spread across her cheeks. Mason, I'm not asking for an immediate answer, he interjected gently. I know we've known each other only a short time, though it feels much longer. I simply wanted you to know my feelings and my hopes. Virginia looked down at their joined hands, then back to his earnest face. When I came west, I was seeking independence above all. I wanted to build a life on my own terms, free from others' expectations and demands. Mason nodded, a shadow of disappointment crossing his features as he began to withdraw his hand. Virginia tightened her grip, preventing his retreat. But I've discovered something unexpected. True independence isn't about standing alone, it's about choosing one's connections freely, based on mutual respect and shared values. Hope kindled in Mason's eyes. And have you found such connections here? I have, Virginia affirmed softly. With the community, with my students. And most especially with you, Mason. You've supported my independence while offering partnership, never attempting to control or diminish me as Harold did. Mason rose and moved around the table, kneeling beside her chair. I would never seek to diminish your light, Virginia. Your strength and independence are what drew me to you from the beginning. And your integrity and compassion are what drew me to you, Virginia replied, reaching out to touch his cheek gently. Yes, Mason, my answer is yes. His smile was brilliant as he stood, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. Their first kiss was tender and full of promise, the beginning of a partnership founded on mutual respect and genuine affection. The new schoolhouse was completed the following week, and the entire town turned out for its dedication ceremony. Virginia stood proudly beside Mason as Chairman Willis cut the ribbon across the front door. Fort Collins is blessed today, Willis announced to the gathered crowd. Not only do we have the finest schoolhouse in the territory, but we also have two citizens whose dedication to education and community embodies the very best of Western spirit. Miss Saunders and Mr. Mitchell, we thank you both. As the townspeople applauded, Mason took Virginia's hand openly, a gesture that caused whispers of approval to ripple through the crowd. I have another announcement, Mason said, his voice carrying across the schoolyard. Miss Saunders has done me the honor of accepting my proposal of marriage. We intend to wed before Christmas. Cheers erupted, with children jumping excitedly and parents exchanging pleased glances. The match was clearly approved by the community that had come to respect both the determined teacher and the generous rancher. That evening, Virginia explored her new classroom and adjoining living quarters with Mason. The schoolroom was spacious and bright, with large windows to capture the natural light. New desks were arranged in neat rows, and bookshelves lined one wall, already partially filled with donated volumes. It's perfect, Virginia said, turning slowly to take in the entire room. Far better than the schoolhouse I originally expected. Mason watched her with a tender expression. Sometimes destruction clears the way for something better to be built. Virginia moved to stand before him, taking both his hands in hers. Like Harold's interference ultimately leading me to you, exactly like that, Mason agreed, drawing her into his arms. Though I'd like to think we would have found each other eventually, even without his villainous assistance. Virginia laughed softly. I believe we would have. Some connections are simply meant to be. They were married in the new schoolhouse 2 weeks before Christmas, with the entire town in attendance. Virginia wore a gown of ivory satin ordered from Denver, and Mason cut a handsome figure in a new black suit. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises of partnership, respect, and enduring love. After a brief honeymoon in Denver, they returned to Fort Collins to begin their life together. Virginia continued teaching, her passion for education undiminished by her new role as Mrs. Mitchell. Mason managed his ranch with the same dedication as before, but now with the added joy of sharing his successes and challenges with a wife who understood and supported him completely. In the spring, they expanded the school program to include evening classes for adults. Mason taught practical subjects like animal husbandry and land management, while Virginia offered instruction in literature and mathematics. The community embraced the opportunity for continued learning, and the schoolhouse became the heart of Fort Collins' social life. By the following winter, Virginia had news of her own to share. On a snowy evening as they sat before the fire in their ranch house, she took Mason's hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We'll need to hire an assistant teacher by summer," she told him with a radiant smile. "Our family will be growing by then." The joy that spread across Mason's face was worth everything Virginia had endured to find her place in the West. He gathered her into his arms, his touch gentle as if she had suddenly become fragile. "Are you happy, Virginia?" he asked softly. "Truly happy with the life we've built?" Virginia thought of her journey from the constraints of Philadelphia society to the freedom of the Colorado frontier, from Harold's oppressive guardianship to Mason's respectful partnership, from seeking independence to finding belonging. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she replied truthfully. "This life, our life, is everything I wanted but didn't know how to name." Their son, Daniel, was born in late summer, a sturdy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. Virginia took a brief respite from teaching, but by winter was back in the classroom with Daniel nearby in a cradle. As Fort Collins grew, so did the Mitchell family and their contributions to the community. A daughter, Elizabeth, joined them 2 years later, followed by twin boys, Joseph and James, the year after that. The school expanded to include multiple classrooms and teachers, though Virginia remained its heart and guiding vision. Mason's ranching empire prospered as well, but he never lost sight of his commitment to the community. He established scholarships for promising students, donated land for a public park, and eventually served as mayor of Fort Collins for 2 terms. 10 years after their wedding, as they stood together watching their children play in the schoolyard that had been the foundation of their life together, Virginia leaned against Mason's strong shoulder. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" she asked. "If Harold hadn't interfered, if you hadn't stepped in to help me," Mason wrapped his arm around her waist, drawing her closer. "I believe some things are meant to be, Virginia. Harold may have sold your teaching post for whiskey, but in doing so, he set in motion events that gave us everything we have today." Virginia smiled, watching as their oldest son helped a younger child with a game. "Including the finest schoolhouse in Colorado territory, built by the finest man I've ever known." "Built for the finest teacher," Mason countered, pressing a kiss to her temple, "and the finest wife and mother." As the school bell rang, calling children back to their lessons, Virginia and Mason walked hand in hand toward the building that symbolized their shared values and vision. What had begun as one woman's quest for independence had blossomed into a partnership that strengthened not just 2 lives, but an entire community, proof that even the most difficult beginnings could lead to the happiest of endings.